He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in the past 3 days, and even those hours had come in broken fragments, stolen between midnight feedings and the soft whimpering of a little girl who still called out for a mother who was never coming back. His name was Ethan Cole, and if you had seen him that morning, walking through the gray drizzle of downtown with his jacket zipped up to his chin and his shoes just barely holding together at the soles, you would not have looked at him twice. You might have even looked away. People often did. There was something about a man carrying that much weight on his shoulders that made strangers uncomfortable, as if exhaustion were contagious, as if struggle might somehow rub off on them if they held eye contact for too long. But Ethan wasn't thinking about how he looked. He wasn't thinking about the stain on the cuff of his sleeve or the fact that his collar was slightly frayed on the left side. He was thinking about Lily. He was always thinking about Lily. She was 5 years old and she had her mother's eyes. That was the part that broke him open every single morning. Every time she looked up at him, those wide brown eyes full of trust and wonder, he saw the woman he had once loved with every ounce of his soul. The woman who had walked away without a single glance back. Not because she was cruel. Not because she didn't care. But because the world had cracked open beneath her feet and she didn't know how to stand anymore. Addiction had stolen her slowly, and by the time Ethan realized how far gone she was, there was nothing left to hold on to. She vanished on a Tuesday. No note. No goodbye. Just an empty closet and the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway like a ghost that refused to leave. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Ethan had done everything alone. He had learned how to braid hair by watching videos at 2 in the morning. He had learned how to make pancakes in the shape of butterflies because Lily once said butterflies were the only insects she wasn't afraid of. He had held her through fevers, walked the floor with her during thunderstorms, and read the same bedtime story 47 nights in a row because she said it made her feel safe. He never complained. Not once. He never raised his voice. He never let her see the moments when he locked himself in the bathroom and pressed his forehead against the cold tile and let the tears fall silently because he didn't want her to hear. He was her father. He was her whole world. And that, to Ethan, was enough. But the world does not run on love alone. It demands payment. It sends bills and deadlines and final notices in red ink. It sends landlords who knock louder each month and grocery prices that climb higher each week. Ethan had worked 3 jobs in the last year alone. He had driven delivery trucks, cleaned office floors after midnight, and washed dishes in a restaurant kitchen where the steam was so thick it made his lungs ache. And still, it was never enough. There was always another bill. Always another gap. Always another moment when he opened his wallet and found nothing but a crumpled receipt and a photograph of Lily that he kept behind his driver's license, just so he would see her face every time he reached for anything at all. That morning, the reason he was walking through downtown was simple but desperate. A friend of a friend had mentioned a job opening. Something about a maintenance position in a corporate building. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would put his name in lights. But it was steady. It was full-time. And it came with health insurance, which was something Ethan hadn't had in over a year. Lily had a cough that wouldn't go away, and the last time he took her to the urgent care clinic, the bill had nearly made him sick himself. So when he heard about this job, he didn't hesitate. He pressed his only clean shirt, polished his shoes with a damp rag, and kissed Lily on the forehead before dropping her off at the neighbor's apartment. "I'll be back before lunch," he told her. She smiled and handed him a crayon drawing of a tall man holding a little girl's hand. "That's us," she said. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his back pocket, right next to his heart. The building was enormous. Towering glass and steel, the kind of structure that seemed to breathe money. The lobby was polished marble, cold and gleaming, and the sound of his worn shoes against the floor seemed to echo louder than it should have. People moved through the space like they belonged to a different species entirely. Tailored suits, leather briefcases, the click of expensive heels, the low murmur of phone calls conducted in voices that expected to be obeyed. Ethan felt every inch of the distance between himself and these people. It wasn't resentment. It wasn't envy. It was simply awareness. He knew where he stood. He had always known. But he also knew that where you stand doesn't define who you are. He approached the front desk with his hands slightly trembling, not from fear but from the caffeine he had substituted for breakfast. The receptionist barely looked up. She was typing something on her computer with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested she had answered the same question 10,000 times and no longer found it interesting. Ethan cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm here about the maintenance position. I was told to come in this morning for an interview." The receptionist glanced at him, just long enough to scan his appearance from collar to shoes, and then returned to her screen. "Third floor," she said flatly. "Take the elevator on the left. Someone from HR will meet you." Ethan nodded and thanked her, even though she had already stopped listening. He turned and walked toward the elevators. There were several of them, lined up along the far wall like silver doors to separate worlds. He wasn't paying close attention to which one was which. His mind was full. He was rehearsing what he would say in the interview. He was thinking about whether the neighbor had remembered to give Lily her juice box. He was thinking about the crayon drawing in his back pocket and the way his daughter had looked up at him that morning with complete and total faith, as if he were the strongest man in the world, as if nothing could ever go wrong as long as he was there. That kind of trust is a beautiful thing, but it is also a heavy thing, because it means you are never allowed to fall apart, even when falling apart is the only honest thing left to do. He pressed the button and waited. A soft chime sounded and the doors slid open. He stepped inside without looking at the panel, without noticing the subtle differences that set this elevator apart from the others. The interior was different. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling instead of brushed steel. The floor was carpeted, not tiled. There was a faint scent of something expensive in the air, something that smelled like old leather and cedar. But Ethan didn't register any of this. He was too deep inside his own thoughts, too focused on the task ahead, too weary from the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from one sleepless night but from 1,000 of them stacked on top of each other like stones. He pressed what he thought was the button for the third floor. The doors closed. The elevator began to rise, smooth and silent, and Ethan leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes for just a moment. Just one moment of stillness. One breath where he didn't have to be anything for anyone. The hum of the elevator was almost soothing, and for a brief second, the tension in his shoulders loosened just slightly, like a rope that had been pulled too tight for too long finally being given a fraction of slack. But that moment didn't last. It never does. The elevator stopped, and the doors opened, but not on the third floor. He opened his eyes and blinked. The hallway in front of him was wide and luminous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded everything in pale morning light. The carpet was thick beneath his feet, the kind that absorbed sound and made every step feel deliberate. There were no cubicles here. No crowded workstations. Just wide open space, glass-walled offices, and the unmistakable atmosphere of power. This was the executive floor. The top floor. The place where decisions were made behind closed doors by people whose names appeared on buildings and whose signatures moved millions. Ethan realized his mistake immediately. His stomach dropped. He reached for the elevator panel to press the button back down, but before his hand made contact, the doors opened wider and someone stepped in. She was tall. Immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been tailored to the millimeter. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek twist, and her heels clicked against the elevator floor with the kind of authority that said she had never once been told she was in the wrong place. Her name, though Ethan wouldn't learn it until later, was Miranda Hale. She was the senior vice president of operations, and she carried herself like a woman who had earned every inch of her title through sheer force of will and an unwillingness to tolerate anything less than perfection. She didn't look at him at first. She stepped in and pressed a button on the panel without acknowledging his presence. But then she paused. Something shifted in her posture. A slight tightening of the jaw. A barely perceptible lift of the chin. She turned her head and looked at him, really looked at him, and what she saw clearly did not meet her standards. Her eyes moved from his face to his collar, from his collar to his shoes, and then back up again, and by the time her gaze returned to his eyes, there was something cold and hard settled in her expression, like a door that had been firmly shut. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question born of curiosity. A question born of offense. Ethan opened his mouth to explain. "I'm sorry, I think I pressed the wrong," but she didn't let him finish. "This elevator is restricted," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is for executive personnel only. How did you even get access?" Ethan's face flushed. He felt the heat rise from his chest to his neck to his ears, not from anger but from the deep, aching embarrassment of being somewhere he clearly didn't belong and being made to feel every ounce of that truth. "I didn't realize," he said quietly. "I was looking for the third floor. I'm here for a job interview and I must have." She cut him off again. "A job interview?" She let out a short breath through her nose that wasn't quite a laugh but carried all the disdain of one. "On this floor? Looking like that?" Ethan didn't respond. He pressed his lips together and looked down at his shoes. The ones he had polished that morning with a damp rag and a prayer. The ones that still had a small crack along the left sole where rainwater seeped in on wet days. He didn't say anything because he had learned, long ago, that there were moments when silence was not weakness but survival. But Miranda wasn't finished. "I don't know how you got up here," she said, folding her arms across her chest, "but you clearly don't belong. This isn't a shelter. This isn't a walk-in clinic. This is a professional environment, and frankly, just your presence here is a disruption." Ethan looked up. His eyes were tired but steady. "Ma'am, I didn't mean to." "Shut up," she said. 2 words. Delivered without hesitation, without volume, without any attempt at kindness. Just cold, flat, final. "Shut up. I don't need your explanation. I need you out of this elevator and out of this building." The words hung in the air between them like something shattered. Ethan felt them land, one by one, in the center of his chest, right where the crayon drawing was tucked in his back pocket, right where his daughter's trust lived, right where his dignity had been holding on by the thinnest of threads. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists or narrow his eyes or say the 100 things that a lesser man might have said in that moment. He simply nodded, slowly, and reached for the elevator panel to press the lobby button. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said softly. And he meant it. That was the thing about Ethan Cole. He always meant it. But what Miranda Hale did not know, what she could not have known in that moment of sharp-edged superiority, was that they were not alone. The elevator had made another stop, just before she stepped in, and someone else had entered from the opposite side of the executive corridor, someone who had been standing in the far corner, quiet and still, watching the entire exchange unfold with eyes that grew wider with every passing second. His name was Daniel Ashford, and he was the CEO of the company. He had built this building from the ground up. He had signed every lease, approved every blueprint, hired every executive who walked these halls. He was a man of considerable power and considerable restraint, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and observed more than he reacted. He had stepped into the elevator intending to ride down to the lobby for a morning meeting. He had barely noticed the man in the worn jacket at first. But then Miranda had entered, and the conversation, if it could be called that, had begun, and Daniel had watched it all from the corner without saying a word. He watched as Miranda's voice turned to ice. He watched as Ethan's shoulders dropped just slightly, the way a man's shoulders drop when he has been carrying too much for too long and someone has just added one more thing. He watched as Ethan looked down at his shoes, and in that small, quiet gesture, Daniel saw something that most people would have missed entirely. He saw grace. He saw a man who had every right to be angry, every right to push back, every right to raise his voice and defend himself, and instead chose silence. Chose humility. Chose peace. And then Ethan looked up, and Daniel saw his face clearly for the first time, and something inside the CEO shifted. Something old. Something buried. His breath caught in his throat. His hand, resting at his side, went still. His heart, which had been beating at a calm and measured pace, suddenly stumbled over itself like a man tripping over a memory he thought he had forgotten. He knew that face. He knew those eyes. He knew the quiet strength behind them, the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself but simply exists, steady and unshakable, like a lighthouse standing against a storm it never asked for. Daniel's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. His mind was racing, flipping through years like pages in a book he hadn't opened in a very long time. He knew this man. He was certain of it. And the realization of who he was, of what he had once meant, of what he had once done, was rising through Daniel's chest like a wave that had been building for 15 years and had finally reached the shore. Ethan didn't notice. He was still looking at the elevator panel, still pressing the lobby button, still trying to make himself small, still trying to disappear from a space that had made it abundantly clear he was not welcome. Miranda was adjusting her cuffs with the satisfied air of someone who had dealt with a nuisance efficiently. The elevator hummed softly. The floors ticked downward. And Daniel Ashford stood in the corner with his heart pounding and his past staring him directly in the face, and he said nothing. Not yet. But his silence was not indifference. His silence was the kind that comes just before everything changes. The kind that comes when a man realizes that the universe has just handed him something he doesn't deserve. A second chance. A reckoning. A moment he had been waiting for without even knowing he had been waiting. The elevator continued its descent. Ethan stared at the floor. Miranda checked her phone. And Daniel watched the man in the worn jacket with the cracked shoes and the crayon drawing folded carefully in his back pocket, and he remembered. He remembered everything. There are moments in life that split time in two. Before and after. This was one of them. Ethan Cole had walked into the wrong elevator that morning, but the truth, the deep and aching truth, was that it wasn't the wrong elevator at all. It was the only one that could have brought him to this moment. The only one that could have placed him here, in this space, at this exact second, standing in front of the one person in the world who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he had sacrificed. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, though he was still thinking about the job interview on the third floor and the cough medicine he needed to buy and the little girl who was waiting for him with a juice box and a heart full of trust, his life was about to change. Not because of luck. Not because of chance. But because some debts are never forgotten, and some men are never truly invisible, no matter how hard the world tries to make them disappear. Miranda said, "Shut up," that morning, and she meant it as a door slamming closed. But what she didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly understand, was that her words had not closed a door at all. They had opened one. A door 15 years wide. A door that led all the way back to a moment Daniel Ashford had never been able to forget, no matter how many floors he built above it, no matter how much glass and steel he placed between himself and the past. Ethan Cole had walked into the wrong elevator. But he had walked into the right story. And the story was just beginning. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft chime, and the doors slid open to reveal the polished marble expanse that Ethan had crossed just minutes earlier with hope still intact in his chest. He stepped out quickly, keeping his head down, his shoulders drawn inward like a man trying to fold himself into the smallest possible version of who he was. Miranda Hale stepped out behind him without a glance in his direction, her heels striking the floor with the rhythm of someone who had already forgotten the encounter entirely. To her, it was nothing. A minor inconvenience. A smudge on an otherwise pristine morning. She turned left toward the executive corridor and disappeared around a corner, her phone already pressed to her ear, her voice already issuing instructions to someone on the other end of the line. But Daniel Ashford did not step out of the elevator. Not immediately. He stood there, one hand pressed against the wood-paneled wall, his breathing shallow, his eyes fixed on the back of the man who was now walking away across the lobby. The doors began to close, and Daniel shot his hand out to stop them, triggering the sensors, forcing them open again. He stepped forward, one foot on the marble, and watched Ethan move toward the front desk with the slow, heavy gait of a man who had just been stripped of something he couldn't name. Daniel's mind was no longer in the present. It was 15 years in the past, and it was falling fast, through layers of time and memory and regret, landing in a place he had tried very hard to leave behind. A place that smelled like rain and cheap coffee and the inside of a bus station at 3 in the morning. A place where he had been no one. Less than no one. A place where he had been broken. 15 years ago, Daniel Ashford was not a CEO. He was not a man whose name appeared on buildings or whose signature moved millions. He was a 23-year-old kid with a duffel bag and a bus ticket and nothing else in the world to his name. He had grown up in foster care, bounced between 7 homes before he turned 16, and aged out of the system with a handshake and a list of shelters he could try if things got bad. Things got bad immediately. He slept on park benches for the first 2 weeks. He ate from gas station dumpsters when the shelters were full. He applied for jobs at every store, every restaurant, every warehouse within walking distance, and was turned away from all of them. No experience. No references. No address. No chance. He ended up at a bus station one night, not because he was going anywhere but because it was the only place open at 3 in the morning where no one would ask him to leave. He sat on a plastic chair with his duffel bag between his feet and his head in his hands, and he thought, for the first time in his young life, that maybe the world was right about him. Maybe he really was nothing. Maybe the foster homes and the social workers and the teachers who had looked past him like he was made of glass had all been correct in their silent assessment. He was invisible. He was disposable. He was a problem that the system had processed and discarded, and now the world was simply waiting for him to disappear entirely. That was when he heard the voice. "Hey. You okay?" Daniel didn't look up. People had asked him that before, and it never meant anything. It was a reflex, like saying, "Bless you," after a sneeze. A social courtesy with no substance behind it. He expected the voice to move on, to shrug and walk away, to file him under, "Not my problem," and continue with its night. But the voice didn't move on. Instead, a paper cup of coffee appeared in his line of vision, held by a hand that was steady and unhurried. "It's not great coffee," the voice said, "but it's hot. And hot counts for something at 3 in the morning." Daniel looked up. And there he was. Younger, of course. 15 years younger, with a fuller face and eyes that hadn't yet learned the weight they would eventually carry. But it was him. It was unmistakably, undeniably him. Ethan Cole. He was wearing a bus station uniform, a navy blue polo with a name tag pinned slightly crooked on the left side. He was a janitor. A night shift janitor who cleaned the floors and emptied the trash cans and wiped down the plastic chairs between midnight and dawn. He was nobody important. He had no power, no title, no authority. But he had a cup of coffee and he was offering it freely, and in that moment, to Daniel Ashford, that cup of coffee was the most important thing anyone had ever given him. Daniel took it. His hands were shaking, not from cold but from the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than the body, the kind that settles into the bones and whispers that there is no point in going on. He wrapped his fingers around the cup and felt the warmth seep into his skin, and something inside him cracked open just slightly, just enough to let a sliver of light in. "Thank you," he whispered. Ethan pulled up a chair and sat down beside him. Not across from him. Not at a safe distance. Right beside him, close enough that Daniel could smell the cleaning solution on his uniform and the faint trace of soap on his hands. You got somewhere to go? Ethan asked. Not with judgment. Not with pity. Just with the plain, honest curiosity of a man who had looked at another human being and decided that he mattered. Daniel shook his head. No. Ethan nodded slowly, as if this were a perfectly reasonable answer, as if homelessness were just another weather condition that a person might find themselves in through no particular fault of their own. You hungry? He asked. Daniel didn't answer, but his stomach did, growling audibly in the quiet of the empty bus station. Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. My dinner, he said. But I had a big lunch. You take it. Daniel looked at the sandwich and then at Ethan, and something in his expression must have betrayed the depth of his hunger, because Ethan placed it in his hands without waiting for a response. Eat, he said gently. You don't have to explain anything. You don't have to earn it. Just eat. And Daniel ate. He ate that sandwich like it was the first real meal he had ever been given, because in a way, it was. Not the first meal in terms of calories and sustenance, but the first meal that came with no conditions, no expectations, no strings attached. It was the first time in his entire life that someone had given him something simply because he needed it, not because they were required to by law or policy or institutional obligation, but because they chose to. Because they saw him. Because they decided, in that quiet, unremarkable moment, that his hunger mattered. Ethan sat with him for the rest of the night. He didn't preach. He didn't lecture. He didn't offer unsolicited advice about bootstraps and hard work and pulling yourself together. He just sat there, occasionally refilling Daniel's coffee from the staff break room, occasionally sharing a quiet observation about the world outside the bus station windows. At one point, a bus pulled in from somewhere far away, and a handful of passengers stumbled off looking dazed and rumpled, and Ethan said, Everyone on that bus is going somewhere. Some of them know where. Some of them don't. But they're all moving. That counts for something too. Daniel didn't respond, but he heard it. He heard it in a way that went deeper than language, deeper than meaning, all the way down to the place where hope lives when it has been beaten into near silence. When Ethan's shift ended at 6 in the morning, he did something that Daniel would never forget for as long as he lived. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside was cash. Not much. Maybe $80. Maybe $100. The kind of money that a night shift janitor saved by skipping lunches and walking instead of taking the bus and saying no to every small comfort that made life bearable. Ethan held it out to Daniel and said, There's a room for rent on Maple Street. $60 a week. The landlady's name is Mrs. Chen. She's tough but fair. Tell her Ethan sent you. She'll give you a chance. Daniel stared at the envelope. I can't take this, he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Ethan pushed it gently into his hands. You can, he said. And you will. Because right now, you need a door that opens. This is a door. Walk through it. Daniel looked at this man, this stranger in a janitor's uniform with a crooked name tag and cleaning solution on his sleeves, and he felt something shift inside him that he had never felt before. He felt seen. Not judged. Not pitted. Not processed. Seen. As a human being. As a person who had value, who deserved a chance, who was worth the contents of an envelope that probably represented this man's entire savings. Why? Daniel asked. Just that one word. Why? Why would a stranger do this? Why would a man who clearly had so little give so much to someone he had never met? Ethan looked at him for a long moment, and then he smiled. It was a small smile, tired around the edges, but genuine in a way that Daniel had rarely seen in his life. Because someone did it for me once, Ethan said. And I promised myself that when I had the chance, I'd do it for someone else. That's how it works. That's how we keep going. We pass it on. Daniel took the envelope. He walked to Maple Street. He found Mrs. Chen. He told her Ethan sent him. And she gave him a chance. A small room with a window that faced east, so the morning sun came in like a promise. He got a job washing dishes at a diner 2 blocks away. He saved every penny. He enrolled in community college at night. He studied until his eyes burned and his hands cramped and the words on the page blurred into rivers of ink. He worked and studied, and every single time he wanted to quit, every single time the weight of his past pressed down on him so hard he thought his knees would buckle, he thought about that night at the bus station. He thought about the coffee and the sandwich and the envelope and the man who had said, "You don't have to earn it." And he kept going. 2 years later, he transferred to a state university on a scholarship. 4 years after that, he graduated with honors. He got an entry-level position at a tech company and worked his way up with the same relentless determination that had carried him from a park bench to a classroom. He was smart, but more than that, he was hungry in a way that people who have never been truly hungry cannot understand. Not for food, though he remembered that hunger well. But for purpose. For meaning. For the chance to become someone who could do for others what Ethan Cole had done for him. 10 years after that night at the bus station, Daniel Ashford founded his own company. 5 years after that, the company went public, and Daniel became the kind of wealthy that most people only read about in magazines. He bought the building he now stood in. He hired hundreds of people. He created programs for foster youth and homeless veterans and single parents struggling to keep their heads above water. And every single one of those programs, every scholarship, every grant, every second chance he built into the infrastructure of his company, existed because of one night, 1 cup of coffee, 1 sandwich, and 1 man who had looked at a broken kid and said, "You matter." But he had never found Ethan. He had tried. God, how he had tried. He had gone back to the bus station, but Ethan no longer worked there. He had asked Mrs. Chen, but she had lost touch with him years ago. He had hired a private investigator who turned up a few scattered leads, a forwarding address that led nowhere, a phone number that had been disconnected, a trail that went cold somewhere in the Midwest. Ethan Cole had simply vanished, the way people sometimes do when life pulls them under and the current is too strong to fight. Daniel had never stopped looking. He had never stopped wondering. He had never stopped carrying the weight of a debt he could never repay, a gratitude so deep it had become part of his identity, woven into the very fabric of who he was. And now, 15 years later, standing in the lobby of the building he had built with the fortune he had earned with the life he had been given by a man in a janitor's uniform, Daniel Ashford was watching that same man walk away. Older now. Thinner. Worn down by years and circumstance and the kind of quiet suffering that leaves no scars on the outside but hollows out everything within. But it was him. Daniel was certain. The face. The eyes. The way he carried himself, shoulders forward, head slightly bowed, not in defeat but in the careful, measured posture of a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible so that the people he loved would have more room. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He felt his eyes sting with something hot and urgent that he hadn't felt in years. He blinked it back. Not here. Not yet. But the emotion was there, pressing against the inside of his chest like a fist knocking on a door, demanding to be let in. He watched Ethan approach the front desk again, watched him speak quietly to the receptionist, watched him receive another flat, indifferent response. He watched the man who had saved his life stand in the lobby of the building that existed because of him and be treated as if he were invisible. And then Miranda's words came flooding back. "Shut up. You don't belong here. This isn't a shelter." Each word landed in Daniel's memory like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction, disturbing the calm surface he had spent years constructing. The woman he had trusted. The executive he had promoted. The vice president who carried his company's reputation in her hands every single day had just told the most important person in Daniel's life to shut up. She had looked at the man who had given Daniel everything and seen nothing. Less than nothing. A nuisance. An inconvenience. A smudge on her pristine morning. Something inside Daniel shifted. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something older and deeper and more dangerous than anger. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when the fog lifts and you suddenly see the landscape for what it truly is, not what you wished it to be, not what you told yourself it was, but what it actually is, in all its brutal, unvarnished truth. He had built this company on the principle that every person has value. He had written it into the mission statement. He had spoken those words at every board meeting, every conference, every public appearance. And the woman who sat at his right hand, the woman who carried his vision forward, had just demonstrated that she didn't believe a single word of it. Daniel straightened his jacket. He took a breath. And then he moved. Not toward Ethan. Not yet. First, he had something to say to Miranda Hale. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the executive corridor, his steps measured and deliberate, each one carrying the weight of 15 years of gratitude and the sharp, focused energy of a man who has just been given a reason to act. He found her in her office, standing behind her desk, still on the phone, still issuing instructions in that crisp, commanding voice that brooked no argument. She saw him in the doorway and raised a finger, the universal gesture for one moment, as if the CEO of the company were just another interruption in her carefully scheduled morning. Daniel didn't wait. He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him, and the sound of it clicking shut was enough to make Miranda end her call mid-sentence. She looked at him with the practiced composure of a woman who was rarely caught off guard. "Daniel," she said, a professional smile forming automatically. "I was just heading down to the sit down," he said. His voice was not loud. It was not harsh. But it carried an authority that Miranda had never heard from him before, a weight that pressed against the walls of the room and left no space for negotiation. She sat. Not because she wanted to, but because something in his tone told her that standing was no longer an option. Daniel remained standing. He looked at her across the desk, and for a long moment, he said nothing. The silence was deliberate. It was the same kind of silence that Ethan had offered in the elevator, the silence of restraint, the silence of a man choosing his words carefully because he understood that words have power, that they can build or destroy, that they can open doors or slam them shut. "I was in the elevator," he said finally. Miranda's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. A micro-movement. The briefest contraction of the muscles around her mouth. She knew exactly which elevator he meant. "The man in the worn jacket," Daniel continued. "The one you told to shut up. The one you said didn't belong here. Tell me what you know about him." Miranda shifted in her chair. "He was clearly lost," she said, her voice steady but slightly tighter than before. "He had no business being on the executive floor." "I simply directed him." "You didn't direct him," Daniel said. "You humiliated him. You looked at a human being and decided, based on the condition of his shoes and the wrinkle in his collar, that he had no value. You told him to shut up. You told him this wasn't a shelter. You treated him as if his very existence were an inconvenience to you." Miranda's jaw tightened. "Daniel, I was maintaining the integrity of the executive floor. We have protocols. We have standards. If anyone can just wander in, standards," Daniel repeated, and the word came out like something he was turning over in his hands, examining from every angle, finding it hollow. "Let me tell you about standards, Miranda. Let me tell you about the standard that built this company." He moved closer to the desk. Not aggressively. Not threateningly. But with the quiet, undeniable presence of a man who was about to say something that could not be unsaid. 15 years ago, I was sleeping on a bench outside a bus station. I had no home. No family. No money. No future. I was 23 years old and I had already given up. And a man, a janitor, a night shift custodian who made less in a month than you spend on a single lunch, sat down beside me and gave me a cup of coffee. He gave me his dinner. He gave me his savings. Every dollar he had. He looked at me when the rest of the world had decided I was invisible, and he said, "You matter." Miranda's expression shifted. The professional composure cracked, just slightly, just enough to let something through. Confusion. Uncertainty. The first faint stirrings of something that might, in a more generous interpretation, be called discomfort. "That man," Daniel said, his voice dropping lower, "is the man you just told to shut up in my elevator. In my building. In the company that exists because he gave a broken kid a chance when no one else on this earth would." The silence that followed was absolute. It filled the office like water filling a glass, rising steadily, pressing against the walls, leaving no air for excuses or justifications or the careful, practiced deflections that Miranda Hale had spent her entire career perfecting. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "I didn't know," she said. "No," Daniel agreed. "You didn't. And that's exactly the problem. You didn't know, and you didn't care to find out. You looked at a man and made a judgment based on everything that doesn't matter, his clothes, his shoes, his appearance, and you missed everything that does. His character. His dignity. His worth as a human being." He paused. Let the words settle. Let them find their way past the armor she had built around herself, past the titles and the achievements and the corner office with the view that she had earned through years of ruthless efficiency. "I promoted you because I believed you shared the values of this company," he said. "I believed you understood that every person who walks through those doors, every single one, whether they're wearing a $3,000 suit or a jacket with a frayed collar, deserves to be treated with basic human decency." I was wrong. Miranda's face had gone pale. The confidence that had radiated from her in the elevator, that cold, gleaming certainty that she was right and the world was arranged exactly as it should be, had evaporated entirely. In its place was something raw and exposed, something she clearly wasn't accustomed to feeling. She was not a cruel woman by nature. She was a driven woman, a focused woman, a woman who had clawed her way up through a corporate world that had not always been kind to her, and somewhere along the way, she had confused hardness with strength. She had built walls so high that she could no longer see the people standing on the other side of them. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "I want you to think about what you did today," he said. "Not as a professional misstep. Not as a policy violation. As a human failure. I want you to sit with it. I want you to feel it. And then I want you to decide what kind of person you want to be, because the person you were in that elevator is not someone I recognize, and it is not someone who belongs in a leadership position at this company." He turned toward the door. Paused with his hand on the handle. "You will apologize to him," he said, without looking back. "Not because I'm ordering you to. But because it's the right thing to do. And if you can't see that, then we have a much bigger conversation ahead of us." He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, and behind him, Miranda Hale sat alone in her corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its view of the city skyline, and for the first time in a very long time, she saw nothing. Daniel walked back toward the lobby. His heart was pounding, but not from the confrontation with Miranda. That had been necessary but secondary. What mattered now, what had always mattered, was the man standing at the front desk with his worn shoes and his quiet dignity and no idea that the building around him existed because of a cup of coffee and a sandwich and an envelope full of hope. But before Daniel approached him, he needed to understand something. He needed to know what had happened. Where Ethan had been. How the man who had once given away his last dollar to a stranger had ended up here, in this lobby, applying for a maintenance job with cracked shoes and trembling hands. The private investigator had found fragments over the years, but never the full picture. Now, standing 20 feet away from the man himself, Daniel felt the full weight of that unanswered question pressing down on him. What happened to you, Ethan? Where did you go? What did the world do to you after you saved me from it? He approached slowly. Ethan was sitting on one of the lobby chairs, the same kind of plastic chair he had once pulled up beside a broken kid in a bus station. His hands were folded in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the floor. He looked like a man who was trying to decide whether to stay or go, whether to push through the humiliation and find the HR office on the third floor or simply walk back out into the rain and accept that some doors were not meant for him. Ethan, Daniel said. The name came out softly, almost reverently, like a prayer that had finally been answered. Ethan looked up. His eyes, those tired, steady eyes, found Daniel's face and searched it without recognition. He didn't know this man. 15 years had changed Daniel in ways that a bus station janitor could never have predicted. The gaunt, hollow-cheeked kid who had sat with his head in his hands was now a broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit with silver at his temples and the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to carry power without being crushed by it. "I'm sorry," Ethan said automatically, already starting to stand, already assuming he was in the wrong again. "I was just waiting for Ethan Cole," Daniel said again, and this time his voice cracked on the last syllable, splitting open like a seed that had been buried too long in dark soil. "Bus station. Maple Street. Mrs. Chen. $80 in an envelope." Ethan froze. His body went completely still, the way a person's body goes still when the ground shifts beneath their feet and they realize that the world is not what they thought it was. His eyes widened. His lips parted. And then, slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape that has been dark for far too long, recognition moved across his face. Not of Daniel's features. Those had changed too much. But of the words. The details. The sacred, specific, irreplaceable details of a night that had happened 15 years ago in a bus station that smelled like coffee and floor cleaner and the quiet desperation of people who had nowhere else to go. "Danny," he whispered. No one had called Daniel that name in 15 years. No one alive even knew it. It was the name he had given Ethan that night, sitting on that plastic chair, too proud to use his full name, too broken to lie. Danny. The name of the kid he used to be. The name of the person Ethan had saved. Daniel nodded. He couldn't speak. The words were there, stacked up inside him like a dam holding back 15 years of gratitude and guilt and longing and regret, but they couldn't get past the tightness in his throat, past the burning in his eyes, past the overwhelming, staggering reality that the man who had changed his life was standing right in front of him in a lobby that existed because of his kindness. Ethan stared at him. His eyes moved from Daniel's face to the building around them, the marble floors, the soaring ceilings, the glass walls, the quiet hum of power and wealth and everything that Ethan had never had and never sought. And then his eyes came back to Daniel, and something shifted in them. Not surprise, though there was that. Not disbelief, though there was that too. What moved through Ethan's eyes in that moment was something quieter and more profound. It was recognition. Not of a face or a name, but of a truth. The truth that the small, unglamorous things we do in the dark, the cups of coffee, the shared sandwiches, the dollars pressed into trembling hands, do not disappear. They travel. They grow. They become buildings and companies and scholarships and second chances that ripple outward in ways we can never predict and may never see. Ethan's chin trembled. Just once. A single, barely perceptible movement that betrayed the emotion he was fighting to contain. "You did all this?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shook his head. "No," he said. "You did." The full story of what had happened to Ethan Cole over the past 15 years came out slowly, not in the lobby, but upstairs, in Daniel's private office, behind closed doors, over a cup of coffee that Daniel poured himself from a machine that cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. It came out in fragments and pauses and long silences, the way painful stories always do, because the truth doesn't rush. It waits. It gathers itself. It asks for patience. After that night at the bus station, Ethan had continued working as a janitor. He had never aspired to wealth or status. He was a simple man with simple needs, a man who found satisfaction in honest work and quiet kindness and the small, daily acts of decency that most people never notice and never remember. He met a woman named Sarah 2 years after the night he helped Daniel. She was a nurse at a community clinic, and she had the kind of laugh that made rooms brighter and the kind of heart that made the world feel less cold. They married in a small ceremony at a park, with paper lanterns and wildflowers and 12 guests who cried through the entire thing. For 8 years, they were happy. Genuinely, simply, beautifully happy. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with a balcony that faced west so they could watch the sunset together. They cooked dinner together every night. They danced in the kitchen to songs on the radio. They talked about having children, about the future, about growing old on a porch somewhere with rocking chairs and grandchildren and all the quiet, ordinary miracles that make a life worth living. And then Lily came. A girl with her mother's eyes and her father's steadiness. And she was perfect. She was everything. She was the answer to a question Ethan hadn't even known he was asking. He held her in the hospital and felt the world rearrange itself around her, felt everything he had ever been and done and suffered collapse into a single point of light, and that point of light was her. But the world, as it so often does, had other plans. Sarah began to change. It started small. A glass of wine that became 2. A prescription for pain medication after a back injury that became a refill, then another, then another. She began to disappear in small ways, missing dinner, forgetting conversations, drifting through rooms with a glassy look that Ethan recognized but couldn't name. He tried everything. He begged her to see someone. He found clinics and support groups and counselors who specialized in exactly what she was going through. But addiction is not a problem that can be solved by love alone, no matter how fierce, no matter how patient, no matter how willing to sacrifice everything. She left on a Tuesday. Lily was 2 years old. Sarah packed a bag while Ethan was at work and walked out the front door and never came back. No note. No phone call. No forwarding address. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't fade with time but grows louder, filling every room, every conversation, every moment with the deafening absence of someone who should have been there. Ethan didn't fall apart. He wanted to. God, how he wanted to. He wanted to sit down on the floor of that empty apartment and let the grief swallow him whole. But he couldn't. Because there was a 2-year-old girl standing in her crib with her arms raised, waiting to be picked up, waiting to be fed, waiting to be held, waiting for the only parent she had left to tell her that everything was going to be okay. So he picked her up. He fed her. He held her. He told her everything was going to be okay. And then he spent the next 3 years making that promise true, one day at a time, one meal at a time, one bedtime story at a time. He worked night shifts so he could be with her during the day. He learned to braid hair and make butterfly pancakes and sew buttons back onto school uniforms. He became both mother and father, both provider and protector, both the strong arms that carried her and the soft voice that sang her to sleep. But the cost was enormous. The night shifts destroyed his health. The medical bills from Lily's recurring respiratory issues drained his savings. The rent increased. The hours decreased. The world, which had never been particularly generous to Ethan Cole, seemed to tighten around him like a fist, squeezing out every last drop of comfort and stability and hope. He lost his apartment. Moved to a smaller one. Lost that one too. Moved again. Each time, the space got smaller and the walls got thinner and the distance between survival and catastrophe got narrower. He never complained. He never asked for help. He never knocked on a door and said, "I'm the man who once gave his last dollar to a stranger. I'm the man who changed someone's life with a cup of coffee and a sandwich. Doesn't someone owe me something in return?" That wasn't who Ethan was. He had given that night at the bus station freely, without expectation, without keeping a ledger, without imagining that kindness was a transaction that would eventually pay dividends. He had given because giving was who he was. And now, when the world gave him nothing back, he simply kept going. Because that was also who he was. Daniel listened to all of this in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer commentary or reassurance or the well-meaning platitudes that people offer when they don't know what else to say. He just listened, the way Ethan had once listened to him, with the full weight of his attention and the full depth of his heart. And when Ethan finished, when the last word had been spoken and the silence settled between them like a blanket over a sleeping child, Daniel reached across the desk and placed his hand over Ethan's. "I looked for you," he said. "For years, Ethan. I never stopped looking." Ethan's eyes glistened, but he didn't cry. He had used up his tears long ago, spent them in bathrooms with locked doors and silent walls, spent them in the dark hours between midnight and dawn when Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet and the loneliness was so thick he could feel it pressing against his chest like a weight. "I didn't know you were looking," he said. "I didn't even know who you'd become. He paused. Swallowed. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Daniel said firmly. "Not anyone. You. You did what you did. And it changed everything." Daniel stood up and walked to the window. The city stretched out below them, vast and indifferent, millions of lives moving in millions of directions, each one carrying its own weight, its own story, its own cup of coffee offered or withheld. He turned back to Ethan. "You didn't come here for a maintenance job," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a correction. A redefinition. A refusal to let the world's version of Ethan Cole's story be the final draft. "You came here because it was time. Because 15 years ago, you opened a door for me, and now it's my turn to open one for you." Ethan shook his head. "Danny, I don't want charity." This isn't charity," Daniel said. "This is justice. This is the world finally getting it right." He sat back down and leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his eyes locked on Ethan's with an intensity that left no room for argument. "I have a position in this company that I've been trying to fill for 2 years. Director of Community Outreach. The person in that role oversees every program we run for foster youth, homeless veterans, single parents, people who are falling through the cracks and need someone to look at them and say, 'You matter.' I've interviewed dozens of candidates. MBAs, social workers, nonprofit executives with 20 years of experience. None of them were right. You know why?" Ethan didn't answer. Because none of them had ever sat down at 3 in the morning and given a stranger their last dollar. None of them had ever looked at a broken kid and seen a future. None of them knew what it actually means to believe in someone when the whole world says there's nothing there to believe in. You do. You've lived it. You are it. Ethan sat very still. His hands, resting on his knees, were trembling again, but not from caffeine this time. Not from exhaustion. From the sheer, overwhelming force of being seen. Of being known. Of being told, after years of invisibility and struggle and quiet, uncelebrated sacrifice, that he mattered. That he had always mattered. That the things he had done in the dark, the small, unwitnessed acts of goodness that no one had ever thanked him for, had not been lost. They had been found. They had been carried. They had been built upon, brick by brick, floor by floor, until they reached the sky. The position comes with a full salary, benefits, and a housing allowance, Daniel continued. Lily will have access to the best pediatric care in the city through our corporate health plan. There's a school 2 blocks from here that has an opening in their kindergarten class, and I happen to sit on their board. He paused. I'm not offering you this because I feel sorry for you, Ethan. I'm offering you this because you are the most qualified person I have ever met for this role. You don't have a degree in social work. You don't have a resume full of impressive titles. But you have something that no degree and no title can give you. You have a heart that never stopped giving, even when it had nothing left. Ethan looked at Daniel for a long time. The office was quiet. The city hummed below. The morning light, which had been pale and tentative when Ethan first entered the building, had grown stronger, warmer, pressing through the windows like a hand reaching out. Finally, Ethan reached into his back pocket and pulled out the folded crayon drawing. The tall man holding the little girl's hand. He placed it on Daniel's desk, gently, carefully, as if it were the most valuable document in the room. "That's us," he said softly. "That's me and Lily." Daniel looked at the drawing. And for the first time in 15 years, the CEO of a company worth billions let himself cry. Not from sadness. From gratitude. From the staggering, humbling, extraordinary realization that the greatest investment he had ever received in his life had not come from a venture capital firm or a Wall Street bank. It had come from a janitor with a crooked name tag and $80 in an envelope and a heart as wide as the sky. 2 weeks later, Ethan Cole started his new position. He walked into the building on his first day wearing a new jacket and new shoes, but what people noticed first was not his appearance. It was the way he moved through the halls, stopping to hold doors, learning names, asking the security guards how their families were doing, sitting with the interns during lunch and listening to their stories with the same quiet, undivided attention he had once given a scared kid in a bus station. He was not a man who commanded rooms. He was a man who warmed them. And within a month, every person in that building knew his name, not because of his title, but because of who he was. Miranda Hale came to his office on a Wednesday afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before knocking, and when she did, her knock was softer than anyone who knew her would have expected. Ethan looked up and recognized her immediately. The woman from the elevator. The woman who had told him to shut up. He didn't flinch. He didn't harden. He simply gestured to the chair across from his desk and said, "Come in." She sat down. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and her jaw was set in the way of someone who was about to do something difficult and was determined to do it properly. "I owe you an apology," she said. "What I said to you that day was unforgivable. I looked at you and I saw what I wanted to see, and what I wanted to see was someone beneath me, because that made me feel important. That's not who I want to be." Ethan looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded slowly. "We all have days when we forget to see people," he said. "What matters is that you're seeing me now." Miranda's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back, hard, the way a woman who has spent years training herself not to show vulnerability blinks back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan smiled. It was the same smile he had given Daniel 15 years ago. Tired around the edges. Genuine at the center. "That's how it works," he said gently. "We pass it on." Lily started at her new school the following Monday. Ethan walked her to the front door, holding her hand, her backpack decorated with butterflies because butterflies were the only insects she wasn't afraid of. She looked up at him with those wide brown eyes, her mother's eyes, and said, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" Ethan knelt down in front of her, right there on the sidewalk, with the morning sun behind him and the whole world stretching out ahead of them, and he said, "We're going to be better than okay, sweetheart. We're going to be just fine." She smiled. She walked through the door. And Ethan stood on the sidewalk and watched her go, his heart so full it ached, his eyes burning but steady, his hands finally still. That evening, Daniel called Ethan to his office. When Ethan arrived, he found the room dark except for a single light on the desk, and on the desk was a framed photograph. It was old. Slightly faded. A picture of a bus station at night, taken from across the street, the fluorescent lights glowing through the windows like a beacon in the dark. "I had someone track it down," Daniel said. "The station closed 8 years ago. But I wanted to remember where it all started." Ethan picked up the photograph and held it carefully, the way you hold something sacred, something that cannot be replaced. You didn't need to remember, he said. You already carry it with you. Daniel nodded. Every day, he said. Every single day. And that is the truth of this story. Not the building. Not the money. Not the title or the corner office or the company that bore Daniel Ashford's name. The truth is simpler than all of that. The truth is a cup of coffee at 3 in the morning. The truth is a sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. The truth is $80 in an envelope and a man who said, "You don't have to earn it." The truth is that kindness, real kindness, the kind that expects nothing in return, the kind that sees a stranger and decides that they matter, does not disappear. It does not expire. It does not diminish with time or distance or the crushing weight of circumstances that would break lesser things. It endures. It travels. It grows. It becomes buildings and companies and second chances and little girls in butterfly backpacks walking through school doors for the first time. It becomes everything. Miranda Hales said, "Shut up," that morning because she looked at Ethan Cole and saw nothing worth hearing. But the universe, which has a longer memory than any of us, looked at Ethan Cole and saw everything. It saw the man who gave when he had nothing. It saw the father who held on when the world tried to pull him apart. It saw the quiet, steady, unbreakable heart that had been beating in the dark for 15 years, waiting not for recognition, not for reward, but simply for the chance to keep giving. And in the end, that is what he got. Not because he asked for it. Not because he demanded it. But because some things, the truest things, the deepest things, the things that matter most in this short and precious life, find their way back. They always find their way back. Like love. Like hope. Like a second chance that arrives on a rainy morning in the wrong elevator, in the right building, at exactly the right time. Ethan Cole walked into the wrong elevator that day. But he walked into the right story. And the story, their story, the story of a janitor and a broken kid and a cup of coffee that changed the world, was no longer just beginning. It was finally, beautifully, complete.